it that you are actually thirsting for in this season? For the children of Israel, they literally were thirsting for water. And it makes so much sense to you and to me, because the truth of the matter is we know you can only survive, what, 3, maybe 5, 6 days without water? We know that, right? So for the people not to have water was a very real and concerning issue. It wasn't like, oh, they're just being ungrateful. No, they needed to know where the water was. They are literally traveling in the wilderness. They have no water. It makes sense that they would want this very basic need. They're not asking for something crazy. They're not asking for anything unreasonable. They're literally saying, I need some water. And that makes sense to each and every one of us. But the issue was they focused so much on their lack that they thought they were lacking God. They were focusing so much on their lack that they thought maybe God forgot about them, or that somehow God had run out. Yet the thing that is so interesting here, look at verse 1. Remember, I told you in verse 1, I told you to circle the word as the Lord commanded. What's interesting here is that the children of Israel were questioning God, even though they knew they were under God's command. It's one thing when you question God and you say, well, God, I don't know if you're here with me. I don't know if I'm doing what you called me to do. But the truth of the matter is, in verse 1, it tells us these children of Israel were literally under God's command. God's presence was literally with them. He was guiding them by clouds. He was guiding them by a flame. He literally was sending manna 6 days a week, manna being food. He was providing provision after provision. There were signs of the divinity everywhere, yet they missed it. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be like the children of Israel, whereby God keeps sending me signs and I keep missing it. Every now and again in my prayers to God, I simply say, God, I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss what you're doing in the season. I don't want to get so caught up in workplace gossip. I don't want to get so caught up in my issues. I don't want to get so caught up in money challenges. I don't want to get so caught up in what people say or think about me that I miss the very thing that God is telling me or doing for me in this season of my life. If that sounds like you in the chat, just say, I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss it. The children of Israel are the perfect example of how you can literally be under the hand of God, yet miss his provision and his power. And so as they were thirsty, these children of Israel, they lash out to Moses, they lash out to their leader, and they literally say, give me something to drink. They say, why won't you? At this point in the text, they literally think that somehow, and this is in verse 2, they think that somehow Moses is keeping something from them. It's a dangerous place, family, when you think that your provision comes from man instead of God. And there are a lot of us in this season of our life living in disappointed ways, or unsatisfied or frustrated, simply because what? We think our provision comes from the people alongside of us. You're frustrated in your job because, well, my bonus comes from my boss. I'm frustrated with my family because my provision comes from my spouse. I'm frustrated in this or that because you've attached the things you need to other people. But how many of you know God will send complete strangers in your midst to bless you? And when we get it in our minds that it's not based, our blessings are not based on the people we see, the people we live with, the people we go to church with, the people we go to work with, the moment we get it in our minds that our provision only comes from God, meaning I could be surrounded by people who don't like me and I'll still be blessed. You can be surrounded by people who talk about you and you will still be blessed. You can be surrounded by people who do not support your vision or what God has told you, and you will still be pushed forward. Why? Because God doesn't depend on other people to bless you. And there's someone perhaps listening to me right now, and you've been in a space where you thought God abandoned you because man or woman abandoned you. You thought God abandoned you because that man walked out on you. You thought God abandoned you because of that deadbeat parent. You thought God abandoned you because of the loss or the grief. But God said, I never intended you to depend on man or woman or anybody except for me. So since every now and again, we got to do a heart check. We got to check the matters of our heart and ask ourselves, wait a second. Could it be that I focus too much of my attention on man instead of God? If you find yourself in a space where you're unsatisfied with God, or you're disappointed, or you feel like he has abandoned you, get to the heart of that thing, sis. Ask yourself, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel so abandoned by God? And if your first response is because they, because he, because she, sis, that's a good sign you got some misplaced disappointment. Have you ever dealt with someone who had like misplaced irritation? Like all you did was go through the checkout line, but the checkout person mean to you because the person in front of you was mean. And you're like, wait a second, I just need my butter and cheese, right? We know that that's so frustrating, yet we do the same thing to God. We're like, God, no, you left me because they did. God's like, right? So keeping this in mind, one of the things that the people, the children of Israel, had not learned in the midst of their thirst is that where God leads you, he will always provide. Where God leads you, he will always provide. And perhaps you're listening to me right now and you just need to make that an affirmation. Where God leads me, he will provide. If God led me to this job, he'll provide me in this job. If God led me to this marriage, he'll provide me in this marriage. If God led me in this season of singleness, he will provide for me in this season of singleness. God is not going to lead you somewhere to leave you. And so some of us are struggling with these abandonment issues with God, and God's like, but I never left you alone. When I looked up more and more about the children of Israel, all I found was time after time after time where God was there for them. He secured their victory over the Egyptians. He made a way through the Red Sea. He made sure they had food and supplies on their journey. Yet, in the midst of inconvenience, they just questioned if God was really there or not. But what we really should be learning right here in this text is a reminder is that God provides in every situation. Write that in your notes. God provides in every situation. And if we're not careful, we'll think that God provides in every situation for people who make under a certain amount of money. God provides in every situation for people who pray a certain amount of times a day or who do this or that. But God is no perspective of man, right? Like he is not like us. He's not blessing based on how good or bad we've been. He's blessing us based on his grace and based on his mercy. So we've got to get to a space where we stop bottling God in. We literally try to put God in a bottleneck and say who he will or will not bless and how he will or will not bless us. And God said, the Bible don't read that way. I never said that. Instead, God said, I promise to be with you in every situation. That means the situations you got yourself into, the situations where I already told you not to go into, the situations where you're just struggling with your faith. God said, I've never left you alone. And so one of the things here in the text, as I kept moving through the text, one of the things that I came across and found was that not only, let me say it like this, not only did God want the children of Israel to get to a place where they trusted him, he wanted them to get to a place that even if it meant them being uncomfortable, they were brought closer and closer. Let me say it like this. I just told the women of the journey a couple of days ago, I gave them this illustration of a crab. Crabs happen to change their shells. They can change them literally up to 4 or 5 times a month, literally. What happens is they'll get to a place of extreme discomfort and they'll leave their current shell and they'll go to the next shell. Scientists ended up finding out that when they switch shells, they were about a third bigger each time they shift. So basically, they got too big where they were, so the shifting had to occur. And I believe that through this text, the thirsting that God allowed to happen was simply to push their shifting. How many of us know that if it were not for the discomfort we experience, some of us would still be in our sin? Okay, I'll start. Some of us would still be in places where God told us not to be because why? It was comfortable. But every now and again, God will push us to a place of discomfort. He will allow the diagnosis to come. He will allow that person to leave you. He will allow you not to get a job you're overqualified for. He will allow you to be surrounded by people who talk about you behind your back, who try to tear you down, who don't like you but smile in your face, who roll their eyes and do all these things. Why? He said, because the only way you're going to draw to me is if you thirst for me. And I don't need you getting drunk off this world. Instead, he'll move us to a place where our full sufficiency is on him. So sis, the reason why you're thirsting isn't because God left you. The reason you are thirsting is because God is so close that he refuses to allow you to settle for a counterfeit. The reason you are thirsting is because God needs you to get uncomfortable enough to shed your shell. So if you are in a comfortable season right now, man, my money's just weird, I'm uncomfortable. My current job is weird, it's uncomfortable. My family is being weird, it's uncomfortable. As a parent, I just feel uncomfortable. As this or that, as I walk in my call, as I try to find my purpose, I feel uncomfortable. And you're trying to figure out, why do I feel so uncomfortable? Could it be that in this season, God is saying, I need you to shed your shell. You've gotten too big. He's saying, in this current shell you're in, I've taught you perseverance. I've taught you about my provision. I've taught you about my promises. I've shown you spaces and areas of yourself you didn't know existed. So you've got to move to the next shell that's a better fit for you. But how many of you know sometimes we don't want to shed the shell? Can we be honest? I know I'm with my sisters tonight. Can we be honest? We don't want to shed the shell, but do you know how ridiculous a crab looks trying to carry around a shell that's too small for it's like hanging off his back leg? It's just trying to move forward, right? It hinders it. It literally hinders it and handicaps it. It makes it go slower. And there's some of you trying to figure out why God has not pushed you to the next season of your life. And the reason he hasn't pushed you there is because you haven't done your part in shedding your shell. He been told you to get out of that group chat. He already told you to stop responding to those texts. He told you not to engage in those calls. He told you not to get down with that group or in that gossip. Yet you're like, but the shell is so comfortable. You're saying, but at least they know my shell. You're saying, but this is a shell I've been in for so long. But God said, if you trust me to shed your shell, watch where I will take you. Says, how will you ever know your growth if you never shed your shell? And you're saying, well, God, I'm in a season and I want to do more. That sound like anybody? Like, God, this is my season of elevation. You put it on your dream board. You put it on your vision board. You're going, God, you put on your prayer board. God, I want to go higher. I want to go deeper. But you won't even shed your shell from the last season of your life. You're still talking about how those people hurt you. You're still talking about your money problems every day. You're still talking about, well, God didn't do this and God didn't do that. It says, how are you going to move forward when you're dragging around an old shell? I don't know about you, but every now and again, I mean, my testimony is dope and it's cool and God's brought me through a lot and I'll always talk about it. But I don't plan to talk about my old testimonies my whole life. Like, I need them to build off some things. You feel me? Like, yes, God brought me through some things then, but wait till you see what God brings me through in this season of my life. And so as we are looking to hear from God and looking for God's presence and wondering if God abandoned us, the first sign that you're going to see to know that God never let you alone or abandoned you, number one, you're going to have thirst. But number two, there's going to be some trust. There's going to be some trust. If you meet me in verses 3 and 4 of the text, it says, but the people were thirsty for water there. They grumbled against Moses and they said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Moses cried to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. Something that is so interesting to me in this text is that the children of Israel are not being holy at all. They are like a mob, okay? They're just being mean at this point. They are tired, they are hungry, they are thirsty, they are hangry, right? There are all these things, but one of the things that they had gotten lost in the midst was that this wasn't only a physical journey where they were traveling from slavery into the promised land. This was absolutely a soul journey. And every now and again, we forget that God has us on a soul journey. Every now and again, we're going through things. We're like, oh, well, I'm going through this because it's bigger than me. I'm going through this for other people. And that's absolutely right. But every now and again, we got to look inside of ourselves and say, we're going through this because there's some stuff God's trying to get out of me. There's some stuff that God is trying to work out of me. I'll admit, I got some unforgiveness problems. I got some judgment problems. I got some this or that problems. And God is trying to work that out of me. And you have to keep in mind the children of Israel were a part of generational slavery. They were in slavery. Their mama had been in slavery. Their daddy had been in slavery. Their aunties and uncles and grandparents had been in slavery. All they knew was slavery. All they knew was abuse. All they knew was heartache. All they knew were people being mean to them and talking down to them and beating them and minimizing them. So imagine all that trauma and torment meeting a good God. They had trouble trusting because of the agony and the abuse that they'd been through. Their past was preventing them from literally acknowledging or receiving the fullness of what God had for them. They were so used to being abused that they were saying, why did you bring us here? In other words, they were saying, we were better where we were. And every now and again on this Christian walk, can we be honest? God, it was better when I drank away my issues. God, at least I didn't have money issues when I gambled. God, I know I wasn't supposed to be with that person, but at least I had a Valentine. At least I had someone to cuddle with. At least I had this or that. It is a dangerous place when we allow our enemy to walk us through a place in our minds where we begin to think that our past is so much better than our present. It is a dangerous place because if God wanted you to be in your past, you would still be there. And there's some of us who are walking around saying, well, I'm trying to get to where I used to be. I'm trying to get to who I was. That ain't who God wants you to be, sis. God is trying to push you to a new season and to a new place with new joy and new mercy and new love and new favor and new grace. But just like the children of Israel had been through so much that they struggled to receive it, I want you to identify right now as you're taking notes, what is it that you have been through that makes it hard for you to receive God's grace and love and mercy? What is it that makes you feel like God's grace is for everybody but you? What is it that makes you feel like the wealth from God is for everybody else but you? What is it that makes you feel like God's healing and deliverance is made for everybody else but you? And so here in the text, I love it because when the people turn into this mob, thousands and thousands going off after poor Moses, it's so interesting because in the text, I love the fact he simply says, verse 4, when he says, what am I to do with these people? I need you to look at it because in all the other parts, he'd be like, our people, my people. But they get to a point where, no, these people, there is a separation, him versus them. And this kind of feels every now and again on our Christian walk. People who at one time were so familiar, who we seem to get down with so much, all of a sudden it's these people. God, get your son, i.e. my husband. God, get your kids, the ones you had me birth. God, get my broke roommate, your son, right? We get to this point where literally those people who at one time seemed so close to us can feel so far away. That will make you kind of wonder where God is, right? Have you ever wondered where God was in your family? Like he allowed some stuff to happen and you're like, God, they're too young for that to happen. God, I kept them in church and that still happened. God, we pray so much and that still happened. Like it's hard to reconcile and literally make sense of that thing. So it is to no surprise that literally Moses says, what am I to do with these people? In other words, he's saying, I no longer recognize them. And what do you do, ladies, when you no longer recognize that man you wake up beside in the morning? What do you do when you no longer recognize those voices that call you mom and grandma and auntie? What do you do when you no longer recognize those coworkers you used to be so tight with that were so nice at orientation and now they're the main ones dragging you through the rug, right? What through the mud? What do you do when you no longer recognize them? What do you do when the very people who at one time were pumping you up, yeah, girl, are the same ones who are now tearing you down, trying to stone you? And this part in the text, I love the fact that in response to it, I love the fact that God literally answers and says, go fetch them some water. I'll get to that in a second. But before we get there, I want you to notice something. A question arose because I'm like, God, Moses was literally trying to do your will here. Like, can we be honest? Like, God, like literally, he had already been through Pharaoh. He's already traveling with these people. Like, Moses is thirsty too. And every now and again, we get in a situation where we are the brunt of attack and we're thirsty too. And you're like, God, I'm tired of being the bigger person. I'm tired of being the wise person. I'm tired of being the one that everyone expects to have it together. I am tired, God, of being the one that has to be the bigger person. Okay. And right now, I so vibe with Moses at this part of the text shed. One of the things that we see here is that there's still this expectation that Moses keeps on going. There's this expectation that Moses doesn't give up. And he's at this quagmire, one that you and I probably face too, because how do you keep moving forward when you do honestly got a lot to complain about? God, how do I keep going in ministry when I got a lot to complain about? God, how do I keep showing up to work every day when honestly I don't even like my job? How do I keep tithing every month when I haven't seen the increase yet? How do I keep doing this or that when I have not seen the total fruition of what it is? And while I'm asking these questions, God, are you with me or not? That's basically what Moses is saying here in the text. He's literally in this uncomfortable place. The people, the children of Israel, the ones who said, are you with me or not? But it's Moses here who's saying, I don't recognize them anymore. They're about to kill me. What is it that you want me to do? And at this point in the text, I couldn't help but wonder, God, like for real though, why did you let Moses go through so much? And while you're at it, why sometimes do you let us go through so much? Yet one of the things God revealed to me is that it was so much of a learning lesson. I shared this the other day in a devotional, which was that this past weekend, my family, we went on a little walk. We love walking in the neighborhood. And we were on a little walk and my baby boy had his little bike and he is a daredevil. He is very much a daredevil and he loves on his little tricycle trying to go up hills. It's a whole situation. He's two. Pray for me, somebody. And so as a result, he went up his little hill and his bike rolled backwards. The next thing, it fell over. So y'all know I'm in full mom mode. I'm about to run to him. And about that time, my husband said, wait. I was like, what? Wait, there's a bike on my baby. He says, just wait a second. See what he does. About that time, my sweet boy looks around and he gets up, he goes like this and he says, bike up. And he puts the bike up and then he gets back on it and goes right back over the little hill to do the trick he was trying to do. In that moment, it wasn't that I abandoned him. In that moment, I just needed him to do the very thing that I taught him. And there's some of us right now who feel like we're being bullied by God, who feel like we're being abandoned by God, but God's saying, no, I never left you. I never abandoned you. I never just pushed you out there. God's saying, I need you to do what I taught you because I taught you perseverance in the last season of your life. I need you to use it now. I taught you about provision in the last season of your life. I need you to use it now. Come here, somebody. God's saying, I taught you and showed you that I'm a healer. So I need you to trust me for your healing in this season of your life. In the last season, remember when I provided your food and showed you that I was a provider? In this season, I need you to trust me to be that for you. In other words, God's saying, don't get brand new and act like I've never done anything for you before. And there's some of us who are getting a type of spiritual amnesia. And at the slightest inconvenience or frustration by God, we forget all that he's done for us. But y'all, sometimes we just need a pause, not because we're praying for something new, not because we're interceding for something new. We need to just pause and think about what he's done. I mean, this isn't a Sunday morning, so I'm not preaching right now. But if I were, I would say when I think of the goodness of Jesus, come here, my Baptist people, and all he's done for me, that's what the text, but I'm not preaching. It's a Tuesday. I'm not in revival this week. I'm not preaching. But if I were preaching, I would say he's been my provider and he's been my Jehovah, but I'm not preaching. I'm not preaching tonight. I'm not repeating. I don't have on my robe or anything. But if I did, I would talk about how he's raised some people from the dead, and he's raised some people from the sick room, and how he's healed some marriages, and how he's kept our minds. I were preaching tonight. I would go down, I'd have a good run, and I would go down how he's been a way maker, and how he's been a lily in the valley, and how he's been a bright and morning star. Every now and again, sis, we ought to pause and just think about what he's done for us. Think about how the devil tried to take your joy, and how he tried to take your peace, and how he tried to take your mind, and how he tried to take your family. But here you are. You may not be perfect, but it's 8:40 on a Tuesday night, and you in Bible study. The devil wanted you to be everywhere else. That's why you had the day you had. That's why you had the week you had. Because the enemy knew if he could just keep you from this nudge and reminder of what God's done for you, he knew he could have you for another day. But now that you've gotten this nudge and this reminder, you just got a reset. Has anyone ever pressed reset for you? You just got a Holy Ghost reset where you're saying, God, you know what? You are undefeated. You know what? You are the doctor of the doctor. You are the doctor of divine reversal. So God, I was frustrated about this diagnosis, but you are the one who can shift the diagnosis. I'm frustrated with my spouse, but you're the one who speaks to my spouse. I don't know what my kids are going through with their root cells, but you can transition them to. God, I don't know what's going on and how you're going to provide, but you're the provider of all providers. But I'm not preaching revival tonight. But if I were, I was just telling y'all what I would say if I were preaching, but I'm not. But if I were, I would have done that. But since it's just Bible study, here's what I'm trying to say. In these times, y'all are so fun. In these times where you're wondering if God is with you or not, we will always find that we got to find there will be thirst. If God's with you, there'll be thirst. But if God's with you, there's got to be trust. But lastly, if God's with you, here it is, there's got to be tools. There's got to be tools. I love the fact that after saying, God, what you want me to do with your kids, what you want to do with your people, I love the fact, verses 5-7, I love the fact that the Lord answers Moses and he says what? Go out in front of the people, take with you some elders of Israel, take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. He said, I'll stand there before you by the rock at Horeb, strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord saying, is the Lord among us or not? Y'all thought I came up with a catchy title tonight. No, I'm just saying what the children of Israel said. Well, so it is. The mob wanted to kill Moses, but I thought it was so interesting because God doesn't say run. Like, that's what I want God to say to me sometimes. Have you been in a situation like, God, if you just get me out of this, like, we don't even have to talk about it with our enemy, just get me out. Have you ever wanted God just to pluck you out of something? You're like, God, if you just remove me from this job, you remove me from this relationship, you remove me from these kids, the spouse, like, God, just pick me up. Like, no questions asked, just pick me up, right? And I could only imagine that in that moment, Moses like, just take me to the promised land. Like, forget them. They are complaining. I know you're real, God. I'm coming to you. They're not. But in this moment, excuse me, I think it's so interesting because there's so much grace shown. Notice here, God sends Moses where? In front of the people. I paused for a moment because I'm like, God, wait a second. It's so interesting because he doesn't say Moses run. He doesn't say Moses flee. He doesn't give Moses a silent treatment. What does he say? Go out in front of the people. This is good news because there's someone on the side of my voice who you keep having to show up every day. And you're like, God, but if you hear me, why do I have to keep showing up? If you hear me, why do I keep having to face my enemies? If you hear me, why do I keep every day having to come face to face with the very ones who are trying to tear me down? You thought it was just you. No, sis, it's biblical. Right there, somebody might need a circle verse 5 for yourself where it says, go out in front of the people. There are times where God will have you go face to face and square up with that enemy in your life. The reason you're doing it isn't because you're fighting by yourself. Quite the contrary. The reason God allows it to happen is because he's fighting for you. And the way they try to tear you down, the way they talk about you, the mean things they say is no reflection at all of you. Instead, God said, I don't want them to see you. I want them to see me. I'm going to perform a miracle through you, but you still got to show up. And perhaps you're a sister right now who you've been cowering down to the enemy, saying, well, God, fight my battle. Like you thought fight your battle meant I'm going to hide down here and God, you fight them and tell me when you're done. And God said, no, I'm working in and through you. So you have to show up, but let me speak for you. You still have to show up, but say what I tell you to say. You still have to show up to work, sis. Just do what I tell you to do. And so right there in the text, I thought it was very interesting because in other words, God tells him, go in front of the people, hit the rock with your staff. And he says, I'm going to make water come out. So in other words, he doesn't tell Moses to run. Instead, he said, go in front of your enemy and fetch them some water. That's the way I read it in the Kaya James version. He literally said, go fetch it. And that right there is so contrary to what we think and the way we treat our enemies, right? Like, we're like, no, I'm just going to ignore them and keep moving my life, Jesus. And there are times where God will absolutely allow that to happen. But there are others of us who can't figure out why God is not taking us out of their presence. Like, God, they are literally at my job. They're literally in the next office over. We share a cubicle, Jesus. Like, what? And in those times, you can't figure out why, but God's saying, I'm going to show grace to them. And in showing grace, you still have to show up. And no, you don't get to say every single thing that comes to the top of your mind. And no, you don't get to fuss them out every day. But I need you to show up. And there's a sister who's been cowering down. And through this message tonight, you were hoping that I told you that cowering down was cool. But in actuality, God said, I need you not to cower down. Why? Because he's called you to greatness. He's calling out the power inside of you. He's calling you to be the woman that he wants you to be. He's calling you to be that lioness, sis. But how will you ever know it if you keep on cowering down from the enemy? So sis, every now and again, I might wake up frustrated, but I got to wipe my tears. I put my little makeup, my little lipstick. This is why I wear lipstick all the time. I lie to you not. I put on my little lipstick. I hold my head up and I keep moving. And there's a sister who's allowed the season of your life to literally stunt your growth because you thought God has abandoned you. You thought people abandoned you. But God wants you to know in this season, he is so present with you. He just needs you to show up. And I don't know about you, but when God tells you to show up, that's not your sign to like, oh, okay, I'm going to show up. And no. If God told you to show up, you show up with boldness and you show up with courage and you show up with confidence. Why? Because God is going to fight that battle for you, but you got to show up. You want God to fight the battle, but you ain't even shown up for war. God's saying you've got to be willing to show up. Show up with a smile on your face, show up with grace, show up with kindness, because here's what you got to remember. God wasn't only using Moses to show grace to the children of Israel, God was showing grace to Moses too. You see, there was another text in Numbers 20, whereby there was a rock and God told Moses to speak to the rock. But instead of speaking to the rock, what did he do? He hit the rock. In other words, what I'm saying is in this, by having Moses go back and hit the rock, he gave Moses another chance. If you don't follow what I'm saying, look up Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20. God literally gave Moses specific instruction at a rock. He said, speak to the rock. But, Moses didn't want to seem like he was crazy talking to rocks. He was like, I'll hit it instead. And doesn't that sound like stuff we do? God tells you to do something like, well, I'm going to put my spin on it, Jesus. You know my heart. And God's like, no, I need you to do it the way I told you to. So Moses got it wrong in Numbers 20, but isn't it good news to know that right here in this part of the text, God's literally saying, I'm going to give you another chance. And that's good news for that sister saying, well, Kaya, I hear you. I'm supposed to show up, but I haven't been showing up. I hear you. I'm supposed to show grace, but I haven't been showing grace. Kaya, I hear you. I'm supposed to do this and that, and I haven't been doing it. This is good news, because if God gave Moses a second chance, he will give you a second chance too. I have maybe 10 more minutes, and I don't want you to miss this last part. Here it is. Notice, God doesn't tell him to go find something new. God uses what's already around him. He says, use the staff that's in your hand and go to that rock. Can you not imagine Moses saying, but God, I passed that rock so many times before. God, this staff, I've used the staff so many times before. God used what he had to perform a miracle. He literally set the stage for a miracle using everything that Moses already had. And there's some of us who feel so far from our blessing and our breakthrough because we don't see how God can use anything we have. God, well, to make me this, you got to do this, and to let this happen, you got to do this happen. And in our type A plan B, C, D, E, etc., it doesn't make sense how God can get us out in this season of our lives. But how many of you know that God will use? Sometimes, yes, he'll use strangers, but every now and again, God will use what you have right here in front of you. Literally, God will use what is directly in front of you to perform a miracle. So, sis, perhaps you've been thinking, well, God, I know you're going to do it next year. Maybe you'll do it in a couple of years. And you've been moping because God feels so far away. But sis, I need you, even in this moment, to feel the closeness of God, to realize that your breakthrough may not just be on the way. It may already be here. It may be just something that you got to get to a point that you're willing to receive. I want you to notice here that Moses goes on, he does what's told. He strikes the rock, water comes out. He does it. The miracle happens. They no longer are thirsty. But I don't want you to get caught up in all the aspects of this story. I want you to focus on this. The children of Israel getting water was never a problem. God was not in heaven like, angels, alert, alert, we need water. God was never panicking over their situation. Water was never an issue. Their trust was an issue. The issue was never the thing they were in need of. That was just what God was using to get their attention. In other words, sis, the thing that you feel is literally dragging you down and taking your joy, that thing that you feel like you are thirsting and you're so desperate for, it's not the end all be all, sis. It's just what God is using to get your attention. And when you put it into perspective, you'll realize it's not God who needs to change, it's us. It's not God who we need to be saying, God, are you with me? Are you with? No. We need to speak in confidence. God, I know you're with me. And because you are with me, this season is purpose to get my attention. So God, I'm going to start giving you my attention because clearly I've been distracted. Clearly I've been thinking that coming to church and doing corporate worship was enough. But how many of you know God desires more? You want to be blessed more than on Sundays, right? So we give him more than on Sundays. That thing that feels all consuming in your life is simply purpose to get your attention. And I hear you're like, but Pastor Kai, what about the grief? It's to get your attention. But Pastor Kai, what about the money problems? To get your attention. But Kai, what about the divorce? That was bad. To get your attention. That's all God wants. The Bible literally tells us that we are created what? For the pleasure of God. So of course, God's going to get our attention when we start doing things that are unpleasurable to him. And you're saying that I've joined this many ministries and gone to this many churches and I've helped this many people and I've done and you can be doing all these good things. But if you are not doing what God has called you to do, as I closed the other day, I literally was talking to somebody. And they were telling me like about all these really good things they've done. They do a lot with people who are like homeless and need clothes. And they were telling me all these good things they've done. And I said, okay, is that what you want to do? And they said, well, I think it's good. I just know it pleases God. I'm like, okay, cool. What are you feeling? They're like, well, God has really been talking to me about, and they went on this whole other narrative of what God is really calling them to do. And they were in such a place of discomfort, but it was because what? They wouldn't shed their shell. They were in such a place of discomfort because they had gotten content doing what they knew satisfied God. Like, yes, God calls us to help the poor and such, but they used that to cover up what they were really called to do. So sis, I need you to do like a whole self-assessment before we meet next Tuesday. I need you to have some you and Jesus time and really ask yourself, ask God, am I really where you want me to be? Am I really doing what you've called me to do? People ask me all the time, Kai, I don't know how you do what you do. You're a campus pastor, you're a first lady, you're a mom, how you do all this stuff, God? How you do all this stuff, Kai? And I'm like, because the stuff God called me to. I say no to a whole lot of stuff. But the reason I'm able to do it is because I literally only do what God calls me to do. Kai, how are you able to do these new initiatives? I do what God calls me to do. And I say no to things God tells me to say no to. Y'all just don't hear about them. Y'all don't hear about my no's. You only see my yeses, right? In other words, I never caught up. You'd be surprised how many preaching engagements. I'm like, no, God didn't call me to that church to preach at this time. Great church. It's just, if God didn't call me to go to Utah this week, I'm not going to Utah, right? And in the same way, be careful not to get mixed up that just because you're doing a good deed is where God wants you to be. You could be exerting the very energy that God actually wants you to be using in your call, in your ministry, and that thing he's called you to do. So since the answer to God, are you with me or not? I believe God's response, if it was a dialogue, is, do you trust me or not? That's what this whole session is about tonight. Since we are in a season, you cannot afford to be faithless like you were last season. You cannot afford to be in this place where you are lacking faith and you are lacking joy and you are lacking truth. You cannot be in this place where you're depending on everybody else's faith. No, since God wants you to trust him for yourself. He deserves it, don't you think? He's proven himself. He has a flawless track record. So let us not be like the children of Israel saying, Lord, are you with me or not? And questioning him at every inconvenience. Let us get to a space of spiritual maturity. Amen. Where we're saying, God, this is uncomfortable. God, I don't like it, but I know you're here with me. I know we're walking this thing out together. Amen.